Carl Djerassi, the so-called father of the pill, recently passed away at the age of 91. Back in 1951, he synthesized a hormone that would become a key ingredient in the pill. Less than a decade later, that pill became commercially available, changing reproductive history forever. Well, joining us now for more in Chicago, Illinois, Jonathan Eig, author of The Birth of the Pill, How Four Crusaders Reinvented Sex and Launched a Revolution. And in our nation's capital, Christabel Sethna, professor at the University of Ottawa's Institute of Feminist and Gender Studies. Welcome both of you to the agenda. Nice to have you here.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Jonathan, let me begin by you. You know, about a decade ago, you published a book about Lou Gehrig, and then a couple of years later, you take on Jackie Robinson, then Al Capone, and then last year, you decide to write a book about the birth control pill. Why'd you want to do a book about it?
Well, for one thing, I like a challenge, and this was something different. But I also thought it was perhaps one of the most important inventions of the century. Some people would say the most important invention of the century, in that it not only changed the way couples have sex, but it changed the way families are made. It changed the opportunities available to women. It changed the balance of power in all of human dynamics, really. And I didn't know much about where it came from, and most people I spoke to really didn't know the story of how we got it. And it occurred to me that in the 1950s, for someone to invent a pill that would liberate women was a pretty radical thing. And the story that I discovered was really incredible, because it never should have happened. These were really, truly revolutionaries, rebels fighting to give women and to give the world something that was nearly impossible to pull off.
There are a number of people, as you outline in your book, Jonathan, that were the so-called fathers and mothers of the pill. But I want to talk about Carl Djerassi. So in 1951, he's this ambitious chemist. He's a fugitive from Nazi Austria. He makes a breakthrough that earns him that moniker, the so-called father of the pill. Christabel, you bring Dr. Djerassi to the University of Ottawa for the 50th anniversary of the pill a few years back. What was his role in creating the pill? What's his legacy?
Yeah, I did bring him to the University of Ottawa. I was very lucky to have a number of grants to enable me to do this. And I had a one-day symposium. This was actually in 2011, because the pill was approved in Canada for widespread use a year after it was approved in the United States. He was a man who was extremely aware of his important legacy, and I invited him to give a keynote discussion. And in the keynote discussion, he talked about his role in synthesizing hormones that became that were essential to the development of what we now know as the birth control pill. But he also spent a lot of time talking about the social implications of the pill. And I think Jonathan has touched on those social implications very well. He was also, he also said things like the pill was not responsible for the sexual revolution. So he tried very hard to place the pill in historical context, and in doing so, he assured the audience of his own important legacy in all of that.
Okay, I want to take a step back. Many of us weren't born prior to the pill. What was life like, Jonathan, before the pill? I mean, we don't hear much about that either. We do hear about the pill, we hear about the sexual revolution, but what was life like?
I think we take it for granted now that women have a choice about when they want to have children and how many children they want to have, and that really wasn't the case before the pill. There was no reliable, effective, efficient, and available form of contraception. So really, before 1960, womanhood equaled motherhood, and women had very few opportunities to really make the kinds of decisions they can today about entering the workforce, completing college degrees, because very often they were getting married young and starting their families very young and having sometimes more children than they really wished or thought they could afford. So the choices were very limited, and women, as a result of that, were sort of forced into these stereotypical roles of being housewives, and you did not see the same, anywhere near the numbers we have today of women completing college degrees and entering the job market.
And Christabel, in terms of what Jonathan just said, I mean, was the pill responsible for changing all of what he just said?
Well, certainly it was a big help. And in my own research, I actually look at one particular group of women and the impact of the first generation of the pill on this group of women. And these are young, single, university-going women. And I found that actually the pill was intended for married women in order to space the birth of their children. In this part of the world, in developing countries, it was intended as a population control measure. And so in Canada, in the research that I've done, you see single women initially being left out of getting the pill. So I think it's very ironic that the pill is always associated with the sexual revolution, with sexual freedom for women, and the very women that were sort of these icons of the sexual revolution, young, single, white, educated, they were the ones who were initially left out. So they battled for access to the pill.
And when it was the pill available in the U.S. in 1960, it comes to Canada, as you mentioned, Christabel, a year later. How was it received in Canada?
Well, the reviews were mixed. There's actually a really interesting article that first appears in Canada in Chatelaine magazine in 1953, in which the author, Gerald Anglin, is discussing this sort of new hormonal development. And in this particular article, Anglin, the author, refers to the importance of the pill as a population control measure, but then raises these really interesting concerns about what might happen if young single women get their hands on the pill. And so there was initially a lot of fear about women's sexual autonomy in terms of what would happen when they ended up with the pill, whereas it was at the same time seen as beneficial as a measure of population control.
And Jonathan, I'm going to ask you the same question about how the pill gained traction in the U.S., but I just want to take a step back with you because we're talking about Djerassi, but there were other people. Your book outlines them. 4 people you talk about in your book, or crusaders, as your subtitle describes them, who developed the pill throughout the 50s. Tell me a little bit about the others.
Well, while Djerassi was working on the chemical compound that would eventually make the pill strong enough to work as a pill, as an oral contraceptive, there were other people who realized that he didn't know that he was working on something for birth control. He was just experimenting with the chemistry. But there was a scientist named Gregory Pincus who had been fired from Harvard, was working out of his own garage for a while, couldn't get work at any university, and he believed that it was possible to do something that women advocates, feminists, had been dreaming of for decades, and that was to create a pill that would allow women some control of their own fertility. And this was very controversial because it was still illegal in the United States to distribute birth control and even to distribute information about birth control in 30 states. So taking on this mission was, some scientists thought it was foolish, some people thought it was illegal, they thought that they would never have any chance to get a business, a pharmaceutical company to agree to manufacture such a thing, the government would never approve the sale of such a thing. So for these people to work on the project, Gregory Pincus, the biologist, along with John Rock, the gynecologist, Margaret Sanger and Catherine McCormick, who agreed to fund the whole thing herself, no university funding for this, no government funding for it, all from the pockets of one wealthy woman.
And so
this was really outside the system. They had to really go underground to get this done.
And they get it done, and then they have to try they get it done. They also have to get people to buy it and get it commercially available. How does that narrative work? How does it gain traction in the U.S.?
Well, what's interesting is they tested it in very clandestine ways. They tested it first in insane asylums and among women who were actually seeking treatment for infertility, and then in the slums of Puerto Rico. But word began to get out, just as you heard about the article that appeared in Canada saying that someday there might be this pill that allows women to control their fertility. When women began to hear about this, they began going to their doctors and writing letters to these scientists saying, I need that now. I've got 9 children. If I have another one, it'll kill me. How can I get that? And they were literally writing to these scientists saying, can you send me some of these pills now? I don't care if it's approved by the government or not. That's a chance I'm willing to take. And there began to be this groundswell. And it became clear to the drug companies that there might be a market for this because so many women were so desperate to have some help in this area of their lives.
As we started off our conversation, and Jonathan, you mentioned, we don't know much about the history of the pill, and it's one of the greatest inventions of our times. And to that point, commentators, have a hard time to sort of understate the impact of the pill. Some do anyways. I just want to read a couple of quotes, what people have said. Margaret Sanger promised it would be a miracle tablet. Albert Mohler, who's the president of the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary, described it as the most important development in history since the exile of Adam and Eve. In 1967, Time magazine wrote that in a mere 6 years, it has changed and liberated the sex and family life of a large and still growing segment of the U.S. population. Eventually, it promises to do the same for much of the world. 43 years later, 2010, Time has a cover story for the 50th anniversary of the pill. Here's what it wrote. It rearranged the furniture of human relations in ways that we've argued about ever since. Christabel, I mean, it has been, some decades, but we are still relatively new to having this product available to us. How would you describe the impact of the pill as we sit here in 2015?
Yeah, well, I would say, I don't participate in all of the sort of these glorious assessments of the pill because, the pill is part of society. It emerged out of society that still is sexist and racist and classist and homophobic, et cetera, et cetera. And so I think the pill, on the one hand, has been marvelous for many of the reasons that Jonathan has already outlined. It has given women and men, we shouldn't forget about men in this discussion, a lot of opportunities to delay childbearing and even marriage. But on the other hand, has it really changed much within sexual relationships? I mean, certainly when the pill, within the first 10 years, women were already complaining and saying things such as, well, my sex life is not that different. I can have more of the same kind of unsatisfying sex with men, but this time without the fear of pregnancy. And I think that we need to be very cautious and critical about these grandiose ideas, often naive and fantastical, but all the things that the pill was going to accomplish. It was going to bring about happily married couples. It was going to put an end to abortion, and it was going to also eliminate poverty, which emerges as a result of population control, population excess. And we know that these issues are far more complex to work out.
Jonathan, do you agree with that? How do you see the legacy of the pill from where we sit today?
I agree completely. I mean, it's a tool, and it's a very powerful tool, but we humans are still the ones wielding that tool, and it doesn't always work the way we dream. And I think the pill did a lot of the things that Margaret Sanger dreamed, that it did offer women a much greater shot at equality. It helped them push, it's one tool that helped them fight for greater equality, but it certainly didn't achieve everything. And in some ways, it did the opposite of what she expected. It certainly has not helped fight world poverty in the way that anybody anticipated. These things are just much more complicated. They exist in a messy world that we all live in.
We started our conversation talking about Dr. Djerassi, and I want to end it. I want to read a quotation. This comes from him back in 2000. And he talked about the key issue of the 21st century will be sex in an age of mechanical reproduction. Here's what he said. It will change the relationship between men and women in a very fundamental way. Sex and reproduction can be separated. One will be for recreation, while the other will be done under a microscope. It is already possible to choose the sex of unborn children. The sperm of recently deceased men can be used to fertilize an egg. A woman could preserve millions of eggs when she is in her early 20s for use when she is postmenopausal in her late 40s. There's so much going on, and the most important three-letter word in this century will not be sex, but. For all of the wonderful opportunities these advances will throw up, there will always be a but. Christabel, much of how the pill changed the relationship between men and women and has done some good things and not. Could the technology of reproduction do much the same?
Absolutely. I mean, we're already hearing about the possibility of a 3-parent baby. There were articles in the Toronto Star and in the Globe and Mail about women freezing their eggs. And Jonathan touched on a point early on in this discussion, saying that originally the pill was something that was used on women who actually had fertility issues or infertility issues. And I think that the pill opened up the door to all kinds of experimentation with female reproduction. What I think is really important to raise is that since the advent of the pill, we haven't had any major advances on contraception for men. And I think that that should be the next frontier. We need to think more carefully about men's role, which is often ignored as a result of the efficacy of this fantastic female-dependent version of contraception. So where are men in this conversation in terms of contraception and fatherhood? That's something that I want to see happening more intensely.
Christabel Sethna, Jonathan Eich, thank you both. Appreciate your time tonight.
Welcome.
Support Ontario's public television. Donate at tvo.org.